Everybody, good evening and welcome, and well done for getting here despite the challenges. Safety. Your check in knowing where the emergency exits are should hopefully not ever have an emergency. David's had an illustrious, or is having an illustrious career in the public transport business, has held senior positions, I think, in almost every form of transport, both here and overseas. So has a wealth of experience, and thank you, David, for giving us the opportunity to hear your views. So over to you, sir.
Thanks,
you have control,
Tony.
And we will take a few questions, etc., afterwards. And by the way, we are broadcasting to the world. We have YouTube working, so the world can listen in if it so wishes. I hope it is. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Can you hear me okay? Good. So, good evening, and as they say at the proms, good evening to those listening at home, if there are any. So I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of the London bus market, a lot of economic data and patronage data. Start with a thank you to the staff at the Library and Archive, and particularly to Helen Grove, who pulled out all the information that I was asking for very efficiently, and they've got a fantastic amount of information there. So what we've done is the kind of thing that people pay us huge amounts of money to do for modern organisations, but we're doing it for quite a modest fee for Tony this evening, which is to go through data and say, what is it telling us? And we've looked at a number of different things, basically London Transport TfL reports and DFT data. Now, the reports, they're really excellent documents, particularly the early years. They're laid out very consistently, very logically from year to year. You can see trends in very logical tables. And many mysteries, or what we think are mysteries, are solved if you read the report, way beyond the topics that we're talking about this evening. There were some unexpected things. There were secret wartime pages. Lord Ashfield obviously was worried that Hermann Goering wanted to know about the trolleybuses in Ilford. So various information was redacted and was held on special documents that were on limited circulation, but those were in the library. And some of the data was put back in the 1946 accounts. There were no computers before the 1960s, so all the data was compiled from millions of ticket returns, conductors' returns, station stubs, and so on. But it's very logical, and it's a very rich source of information on all sorts of things. For example, there's pages and pages about the freight on the Metropolitan line and how many milk churns were handled at Amersham, and so that's all in there as well. So what is the economic story? Do the facts fit some of the myths and beliefs that we've picked up over the years? What are the long-term trends? And are there any lessons for today? And there's some surprises, and there's some confirmation of things that I think we knew. So I'm going to talk about buses, but before the war, in fact before the 1960s, a great deal of the surface transport was on the trams and the trolleybuses. I'm not going to say very much about the Underground or the DLR, although they do impose slightly on the data, but they're not the core story. And of course, the green buses and the Green Line disappear from the story in 1970. And so before the war, the operating area was really the inner home counties. So it's rather wider than today. And that contracted in 1970, basically to where we are today. In both cases, there were services going across the border. So what is the answer? For anyone who's planning to go to sleep this evening, I thought I'd give you the answer at the beginning, in case you missed it. So this is the story since 1934 of passengers. And, you know, this is obviously a 90-year story. There's a lot of twists and turns here. But you can see two strikes that I've highlighted. There was the big strike in 1937, and another one in 1956, and of course 58. Then there was the war, which had both a negative and a positive effect, and there was a lot of social change after the war. So that's a mixture of things. That's population decline and suburbanisation of population, but also the growth of car ownership, television, industrial unrest, kind of weak economic growth in different parts of London, a lot of things going on. And then there's COVID. And the COVID effect is by impact on patronage and finances. That is really comparable to the war. So it's a very, very big effect. So to try and make it more easy to understand, what I've done is I've indexed all the patronage to 1934. So 1934 is 100, and therefore you can see the movement. So by 1948, they had about 30% more passengers. And then from 1949, it kind of went down continuously with some ups and downs to about 1980, 82, and then it starts going up again, and then it starts going down again in 2013. So that's why I've called the presentation as we have. What this means is, by 1982, they were only carrying 35% of the 1934 number. So hopefully that's a simple way of thinking about the movements. And we're currently carrying a bit less than 60%. If we add back the country buses, it might be 65%, but it's something of that kind of order. So it's been a story of ups and downs, and if you drill into any decade, there is more detail. So we'll start with talking about the 1930s and 40s, the golden age of beautiful vehicles, Art Deco posters, the coordinated network, Lord Ashfield sitting in his cuboid office planning everything. So this is the beginning of the story. Now, the first thing that you see in the data is the trams and the trolleybuses were a very big part of the overall picture at that time. They were larger vehicles, they're mainly 70-seaters. The buses were between 20 and 60-seaters. And they'd started trials with trolleybuses. So I think this is an interesting comparison between the diesel to electric conversion that we're doing at the moment. And they had plans to ramp up the trolleybus system. There's a bit of evidence, we didn't really get to the bottom of this, and we could probably do so, that they were quietly allocating some mileage from the diesel buses to the trolleybuses at the margins. And very importantly, the tram and the trolleybus staff were on lower wages and much more flexible working conditions. And that's one of the principal reasons why they didn't go to diesel buses and why they kept the diesel buses separate from the trams and the trolleybuses really until the very end of the trams, when by that stage they converged the working practices. So they were a bigger part of the story. So what were the costs of running the network? And what this slide shows is the cost of running a bus or a tram or a trolleybus, and it's 100% in every case. So what is the cost of running a mile? What is the composition of that cost? The blue is the labour cost. So as you would expect, the main cost, as it is today, was labour, but not as much as it would be today, not as weighted towards labour. And the other thing that you would expect to see, and you do see, is that the maintenance costs on the trams and the trolleybuses were higher. There was more stuff to maintain, particularly the tram track. You can see that the tram maintenance costs are quite a lot higher. And the depreciation, so that's the asset replacement, surprisingly low. And I'm not quite sure why that's such a low number, given the capital intensity of the trams. So as a person who's run these kind of organisations, first question is, well, was it making any money? Were the buses making any money in 1934? And the answer is yes, but let me explain what I mean by making money. So I'm calling this a contribution, and this is the excess of the revenue over the costs. Now, that's not a pure profit, because they had to pay for the overheads, Lord Ashfield's wages, etc., the 55 Broadway costs. But the big thing they had to pay for, and I think that was the motivator for the whole organisation, was that they'd incurred, in modern money, billions of pounds of debt building the underground and building the trams. And all of that debt was sitting around on the balance sheet of this new organisation, which is like the BBC. That's to say, in 1934, it wasn't owned by anyone. It wasn't owned by the government in 1934, but it wasn't owned by private shareholders. It was basically a great big pile of debt, and they were paying interest on the debt. So actually, the buses were making a very healthy profit in 1934. For every 100 pence in revenue, it only cost roughly 80 pence to run the service. So they were making a big contribution. The trams a bit less. The trolleybuses a bit less. But in 1934, the trolleybuses were just a little suburban network in Kingston. As the 30s progressed, they had better routes, and it would have made a higher profit. So it was profitable. The split of the bus profit between tram and trolleybus, you can see there, is about 80% on the buses. So they had a good business, but they had a hell of a lot of debt they had to pay interest on. This is the passenger split in 1938, and in the 30s we can see a kind of constant pattern between the buses and the trams or the trolleybuses, and it's about sort of 70-30 in favour of the buses, and that includes the country buses. So now we're looking at the trams and the trolleybuses only, and I think this is an interesting comparison with today. 100% of passengers, so you're seeing in light blue the trolleybuses coming in. And what strikes me about that is just how rapidly they brought the trolleybuses in. They'd been experimenting for a few years, but most of the conversion was done over really 4 or 5 years, between about 1935 and 1940. And of course, they did it depot by depot and not route by route. And I think that was a logical way of doing it, and maybe a better way of doing it than we're doing it at the moment. So a very rapid ramp up of the trolleybus operation. Now, this is the more obvious graph. This is all the passengers from 1934 to the war. And you can see the split there between the trams and the buses and the trolleybuses. And this graph rather surprised me. So we had the strike. You can see the effect of the strike in 1937. But the growth was only about 2% per annum. I was expecting a much bigger number than that, considering all the different things that they were doing. So they grew the passengers by about 10% over five or 6 years. But they grew the underground passengers by about 17%. So there was some movement going on to the underground. But I was surprised this wasn't a faster rate of growth, given all the good things they were doing. By the time we get to the 1947 accounts, you can see some analysis that they were doing themselves. Lord Ashfield's own homework. He probably didn't do it himself, but he must have marked the homework. And this is his graph. To make it easier, I've coloured it in. And what this is doing is it's comparing population with bus and underground use. So it's not just the buses, it's also the underground. And this is very important to the long-term story. The population went up a bit between 1934 and the war. And then you can see the population drops when the war starts. So we know why that was. People were sent away, evacuated, they ran away, they moved to the suburbs. It kind of recovers after the war, but it never gets back to the 1939 number until the last 10 or 15 years. So for most of the period from 1939, the population was going down. Of the Greater London area, so their area. And that's a very good question, because obviously another thing that was going on, and you'll see it in some later data, the population was moving from the centre to the suburbs and even to the new towns. And in the early 1950s, you can see in the reports, they were very optimistic. I mean, Andrew will remember this, the growth of the new towns, London country, etc. That was a big part of the story. And that was not an accident. That was public policy after the war to depopulate London and move people out. The blue line is the trip rate. Now, this is always a very interesting number. This is the number of trips that an individual makes in a year by all modes of transport. And again, normalised, 100 is 1934. So you can see in the 30s it went up a bit, then it went down at the beginning of the war. So again, it's like COVID. People were told to stay at home. And then it starts to go berserk towards the end of the war and after the war. So one of the myths is that there was a post-war boom, and that isn't a myth, that is a fact. The next one of Lord Ashfield's charts is journey length. So the red is the passengers, we've talked about that as the passenger movement. And the next one is the blue, the passenger miles. So this is your point about suburbanisation. Journeys are getting longer as time goes on, and probably less profitable to run longer journeys. And they did run some extra services, but not comparable to the growth in traffic. And that's why we had the famous overcrowding after the war. So that was a fact. So the 50s and 60s, I'll go over this quite briefly because any of these decades you could talk about for hours. But really, this is a story of decline. Beginning of the 1950s, they had about 30% more passengers than they had in 1934. And then it went down. There were the strikes, there was the social change, and by the end of the 1960s, they were only carrying about half the passengers that they'd been carrying in 1934. So that's the overview of the 50s and 60s. And there were many reasons for this. Depopulation was a key one. Now, what were the policies of that period? Very briefly, obviously the trams went. By that time, the pressure from the trade unions meant that the wages of the trams and trolleybuses had converged with the red buses. So there was a weak argument on an operating cost basis to keep them. And you saw in the report specifically, they intended to transfer the power generation from the trolleybuses to powering the Central Line extension. They already had a giant power station at Greenwich, and they could put that over to the Central Line. The power distribution equipment for the trolleybuses was 50 or 60 years old. It wasn't 20 or 30 years old. Most of it was the tramway equipment from the 1900s, and that was due for replacement. And the trolleybuses were 20 or 25 years old. Now, again, I see an analogy here with the electric buses. You would expect, and there's lots of evidence, that electric buses will last longer than 15 years. And if you really believe that there's a climate crisis, and if you really want to optimize the budget, you should keep them longer than 15 years, and they certainly ran much better. They were more expensive vehicles than the diesel buses had been in the 1930s. And then we had the reshaping plan. Oh, that would be an interesting set of things to look at. It was the route shortening, it was pay-as-you-enter buses, automatic fare collection. They tried a whole load of things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, but in aggregate, none of that worked very well. Now, the 1969 report, it didn't actually say blimey in this section in the report, but that's what they were thinking. They were looking back, and they were worrying about what was going on. The patronage had dropped by 20% in 5 years, and they'd cut the service by 11%. But this is the pattern that they could see that they were in. They were beginning to get some help from the government in terms of one-off payments. In the 1930s, they'd had capital grants and cheap loans, but by this stage, they were rattling the tin and getting some money directly from the government to keep the show on the road. So it's getting quite difficult. The 50s were the sort of high water mark of Green Line, and it had a second high water mark in the late 1970s, but the 50s were when London Transport ran it, and it was only carrying about 1% of the passengers. There were about 8% on the country buses, and you can see, about 90% on the buses and trolleys, and the trolleys were still carrying 20% of the overall picture at that time. But of course, the journeys were very different on Green Line. The average journey was almost 12 miles long. So that's from an outer part of London to central London, or it might be between two suburbs, or it might be between Tunbridge Wells and Bromley. Those kind of journeys were being made on Green Line. The tube journey is about 5 miles long. Country buses, surprisingly short, 2.5 miles, and the red bus is about 2 miles. So they were conscious in the annual report that as the services were becoming unreliable, particularly going into the 60s, they were losing these very short distance journeys. If the buses weren't turning up or the frequencies were reduced, and the headway was wider, they were losing very short journeys, maybe less than a mile. So by 1969, when the country buses went away, they were carrying about 12% of the remaining traffic. There had been some growth in the country buses because of the new towns and the suburbanisation that was mentioned. So in 1934, we said it was making quite a nice profit. Was it making a profit in 1969? Unfortunately not. The gold bar represents the takings, the cash, about £66 million. And there's a whole series of costs, wheel turning costs, which include fuel and drivers, maintenance, etc. Unfortunately, the costs were 70 million, and 70 is bigger than 66. So result was misery. They were making a loss of about 4 million, and that's red and green buses. And that's also with the aid of a bit of government subsidy. So what were the costs in 1969? They've changed a bit since 1934. The black bar is all the wheel turning costs, the drivers and the fuel, so we recognise that number. But I was quite surprised that the maintenance cost was so high, 14%, and the overheads were so high at 11%. So that's evidence of flabbiness because by this stage there were no tram tracks or trolleybus wires to maintain. Why was the maintenance cost so high? Surprising numbers. So the 60s was a pretty grim period. This is a sort of summary from their report. The red line is the passenger miles, so we're taking account of journey length on the buses going down. But the blue lines are the underground, and you can see that the underground was retaining its patronage, and that's been a long-term trend. The underground has done better. Why is that? Well, the underground offers reliable journey time, fast journey time. So that pattern was apparent even as early as the 60s. 70s and 80s, quick go through the 70s and 80s. Without wishing to offend Andrew, I think they were probably quite pleased to see the back of London Country. It saved them a big financial problem. It was one less thing to worry about.
The sad thing, though, David, was being on the other end of that and inheriting a fleet with an average age of 18.2 years.
Well, indeed. And I think an alternative view would have been they could have had a PTE type structure that included the home counties and the surrounding areas. But it doesn't change the numbers very much, is really the purpose of this slide, because the number of passengers on London Country was so small by the end of the 1970s. So 1970, they had 50% of the 1934 passengers, and by the early 1980s, they only had 35% of the 1934 passengers, and then the tide turned and it started going up again. And quite a lot happened in the 70s and 80s. Again, I'll skim over it because it's a whole different presentation. But obviously one-person operation was a huge part of the story. They struggled with vehicle reliability and staff shortages really for about 15 years. They were struggling to get the show on the road. And they were asking each year for more and more subsidy in a kind of emergency way from the government until by 1984 it was removed from the GLC and handed back to the government on the basis that if they were paying for the losses, they wanted to control it. Now that coincided and really caused a kind of change in orientation from being what the EU would call a public transport operator to a passenger transport executive. And they started doing things that probably they should have been doing since the 1950s, like changing the network, doing some marketing, all sorts of things. And of course, they started outsourcing a lot of the operation from 1985. So a very big set of changes over a 20-year period. So then it started getting back on track. They started in 1990 with 40% of the 1934 number. And by 2009, they were at 76% of the 1934 number. So that's a massive increase. If you're starting at the 1993 number, they kind of doubled the number of passengers. So a lot was going right in that period. Now, why did that happen? One of the main reasons is the population started going up again. This is the population over the same period since 1931. And you can see the peak just before the war. And it goes all the way down to 1981, and then it sort of levels out. And then from 1990, the population starts going up. So there were 30% more people. If you look at water consumption statistics, how many times do people flush the loo? There are more people in London than that. This is probably an understatement by up to 1 million of the number of people in London, some would say. Now, it wasn't all about population. They did a lot of very positive things. That you could argue they should have been doing decades before. They reviewed the network. They made the network much more reliable. There were innovative things like minibuses and low-floor buses and route-branded buses. They improved information. But they also had very rapidly rising subsidies from 2000. In the 1970s, the subsidies were a cause of great political anxiety. But from 2000 onwards, the subsidies seem to be normalised. But I would argue that since 2000, there's been a kind of move to a more Soviet-type network, very homogeneous, with less innovation. And that's maybe caught them up a bit. So in the 2010s, the miserable story of decline resumed. And you can see here that the cyclists are in front of the buses. And I think that's basically the story of the 2010s, that elite opinion shifted towards cycling. It's not a party political thing, it's an elite thing. Cycling is very important to elites in Western countries at the moment, and that became the primary policy driver. The trams, quick word on the trams, we have trams again. They carry so few people, I'm not going to talk about them. They're immaterial to the story. So to make this easier, I've indexed this to 2000 as 100%, because otherwise it's too confusing. But we saw early on in the TfL story a real focus on buses as an in-fashion mode of transport, the preparation for the congestion charge, extra services and so on. Then we had the overground and urban rail improvements. And of course, because the bus journeys were becoming slower, they were starting to take passengers away from the buses because the bus services were so slow. Then the Olympics was kind of the high point of London optimism. And then COVID, the horrible COVID impact. And the Elizabeth line. Now, the Elizabeth line is important because it created capacity on the underground, and it meant that people could switch from the buses to the underground that previously was congested. So they've lost about 22% of the passengers from 2013 to 2023, so quite a big reduction. At the same time, the population continues to go up, so the trip rate has gone down, and what we're seeing is a shift from buses to overground and rail, and to cycling and walking. Bus use in London versus other places, it's still carrying 3 times the national average. So it's still a very high use of buses in London. But the trip rate is going down, and some of the other places, not many, but some, are going up. Now, this is the fleet, the bus fleet versus the number of passengers. And the blue line is the passengers. And what you can see there, interestingly, is the bus fleet was going up as the passengers were going down. Now, I attribute that to the fact they tried to slow, as the services were slowing down, they had to run more buses for a few years to try and run the same level of service. After a few years of that, they started taking buses out. So the bus fleet is now going slowly downwards. So hypotheses, why is this happening? London has got a growing population. It's very difficult to use cars. I would expect bus use to be going up by 2, 3, 4% per annum. Why is it going down by 2 or 3% per annum? I think the answer is journey times. This is my most common journey, which is to go from my house, which is quite near Leon's house, and come to somewhere quite near here on the 15 bus. And in 1967, it would have taken about 27 minutes. It would have taken me 3 or 4 minutes to walk to the bus stop. And it still takes me 3 or 4 minutes to walk to the bus stop. But you can see as the years go on, by 2008, it was 45 minutes. And then it got better in 2010. That might have been some sort of Leon-orientated magic. But unfortunately, after Leon left, it all went horribly wrong. And that is a journey time which is quite uncompetitive with the underground option that I would have. I could walk much quicker than 95 minutes, and I could cycle in 30 minutes. So that, I think, is at the root of the problem. Now, of course, as the speed drops, the costs go up, because most of the costs are time-related costs. You need more buses, you need more drivers, you need more pensions. All of that goes up as the buses go slowly. The patronage goes down, the revenue goes down, but I think also the political salience goes down. We're getting to a position where buses are being seen as being a bit of an oddball thing, whereas the smart people are cycling, maybe. So I think a question that needs to be asked is, what are the buses for? Who are they for? Why do we have buses at all? And here are 2 ways of thinking about it. One is that the buses are for the refuseniks. They're for the people who refuse to buy their Lycra, buy their bike. They won't walk. They don't want to go on the railways. Maybe they're too doddery to go up and down the steps on the underground, or there's no underground or rail in their area. That's one view of the buses. The second view is, well, omnibus, it should be something that everyone is interested in. We should try and increase the appeal of the buses to a wider number of people by making them faster and more reliable. But also there's the economic component of this, and I think that's very important, particularly at the moment. This is UK debt. In 1997, it was about 30% of GDP. It's now 100. The FT is forecasting it to go to 200 or 300. That will not happen because the country will go bankrupt. Here's a picture I got of Rachel Reeves just after she'd looked at the TfL business plan. And it just can't carry on like this. That is not a viable plan. So as Vladimir Lenin once asked, what is to be done? Option one, which I think is the current, by observation, the current TfL plan, is a sort of do minimum strategy. There will be more bus priority. The costs will slowly go up, or even rapidly go up in some circumstances. The subsidy per passenger will go up, and they'll keep trimming the network. And there'll also be some shift of the network from the centre to the suburbs because of the decay in the centre. That's because there's more rail in the centre and more cycling schemes have been implemented in the centre. So that's kind of one policy, and they've got a 5-year business plan. I think this is more than achievable. You can sort of go along like this for quite a long time. The second option, which they knew about in the 1960s, is to try and make the buses attractive. You know, there were various things in the 60s, some of which worked, some which didn't work. There were the red arrows, there were the blue arrows, there were super buses a bit after the 60s, but all of these kinds of things. But what you would be doing is targeting routes and parts of the network where buses could make a positive impact and really trying to speed up those buses, but not trying to do it everywhere. You would have to reallocate road space, and that means that you'd have to have a more subtle balance between buses, cycling, cars, walking, than simply saying it's all about cycling or all about walking. And that, I think, would be politically difficult, but it's an achievable plan. And this would have the added benefit of growing revenue and reducing costs. So I think this is the core of turning that graph around again. The third thing you could do, I call it clever things. They did clever things in the 1930s, and people around the country doing clever things like nicer buses, smiley drivers, improving the marketing. These are all relevant things. But I would say two things as a word of warning. The first one is, to do this, they would have to move away from the idea of a homogeneous bus network where every route is treated the same. You would have to have a plan and prioritisation, and not every route would look the same, and that might be politically difficult. But the second thing to say, and the more important thing, is there's no point doing these clever things if you haven't got the journey times right. So I think this is something you would do in addition to bus priority, but not instead of bus priority. And if you do these things without the bus priority, it probably won't work, or it would have a very small effect. So, where are we now? We're at a kind of turning point. The graph, I think, could change direction again. It's very plausible to imagine a large increase in bus passengers. That would not require experimental measures. That could be done by things that either have been done in London in the last 30 years or are being done in other parts of the country. There would be some political cost, because there would need to be a discussion about how road space is allocated and whether buses are relevant in that new allocation. And there would be financial benefits, both in terms of reducing the cost of the current bus network, but also improving the public transport network at lower capital cost than some of the rail ideas that are floating around. So that is the positive trajectory. The do-nothing trajectory is probably a bit more decline, caused by bus speeds declining and population growing, the net of those two numbers. What will they do? I don't know. The opportunity is very large. Will they take it? So, Tony, that's all I wanted to say in terms of data, and we can maybe discuss some of these things. I'm sure some people would disagree with some of those things.
Thank you very much indeed. You covered areas that I don't think we have done before, looking at the business side rather than just the routes and everything else and the vehicles. Going back to the founding days and so on and the 30s, if you were there then, what would you have done differently that might impact on today's things? Would you have kept the trams or what? If you were the chairman, where would you have taken London Transport before the Second World War?
I think it's a very hard question to answer. They'd taken over, some people in the room may know the answer, but it's in the order of 50 to 100 companies in the space of 6 or 7 months. So I think that they were swallowing an enormous inheritance. There were, 7, 8, 10, how you count them, tram operations. So my sense is in the 1930s, they were very preoccupied with that. Some of what they were doing in the 1930s, and you can read it in books that are for sale upstairs, is perceived as being a good thing, but I'm not sure was a good thing. So, for example, some of the evil pirate operators had comfortable buses, but they were non-standard. They had to be removed. Some of them had low fares. The low fares were non-standard. So I think what you saw in a lot of what they did in the 1930s are the typical behaviour of a corporate organisation. And remember what London Transport was. The Underground Group was essentially an American created private equity-backed infrastructure fund. And they had been fixated on the idea that if only they took over the district railway, their financial problems would go away. If only they took over some of the tram companies, if only they owned the bus company. So I think what you saw in the 1930s is a behaviour. We've seen it more recently under TfL. If only we controlled cycling, somehow the problems will go away. Now, the counter-argument is maybe they've got too many problems to deal with. But I think in the 30s they did pretty well. They had no computers. They had no subsidy other than some cheap loans. They did achieve quite a lot. And obviously they would have done, we know, a lot more after 1940. A lot of the underground improvements which occurred in the 50s were planned for the 40s. So I give them a lot of credit for that. I think the problem that they had, that you could see even in the 30s, was that being a monopoly organisation, they had negative cost pressures on them. And there was always going to be a risk it became flabby. There was always going to be a risk of rent-seeking by the unions and so on. And that did latterly occur. So I don't want to be very critical about them. A further point to make, of course, is the economy of London was a tale of two halves in the 30s. It wasn't all depression and people in clogs, eating tripe and so on. But there were areas of economic growth, but there was some economic weakness as well. But London and the South East were generally doing quite well in the 30s. So I think they did pretty well, but some of the writing was on the wall very early on.
I think one point before I open it up, I found in joining London Transport, I joined a family.
Yes.
I felt suddenly part of the business, even as a lowly clerk. And I think that was the great thing there. But yes, it was a little bit, I think, looked down on the world a little in the early 60s. And I think when, as I've referred to it, the Dagenham dustbin, the Ford Anglia came at an affordable price. I don't know whether any public transport operator could really withstand that competition from an affordable motor car.
And fast. I mean, if you had a car, you could drive it very fast and park it very quickly.
Yes. And
the car journeys were very, very rapid, even though the buses, by modern standards, I mean, don't forget, we laugh upstairs, there are buses with, was it 25 mile an hour maximum speed? We now have a 20 mile an hour maximum speed. So, the journeys in general were faster than you would expect because of the absence of traffic congestion, including by car.
Right, thank you. Now, everyone, questions, thoughts, comments? Bring down perhaps Andrew first and then, no.
Thank you. Excellent, David. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Quite a bit of stuff in there that I'd forgotten. One comment on the rapid rise of trolleybuses and the big conversion scheme in the 30s. It's interesting that that was paid for by the government.
Yes.
The so-called New Works programme that also contributed the outer ends of the Piccadilly and Central lines pre-war. That was a massive investment by government, and it's so sad that in recent years in the UK we've had precisely the same circumstances, a desperate need to invest in infrastructure which is quite different to ongoing revenue costs, but we failed again and again and again to recognise the need to do that. Second thing is that a huge amount of the slowing of bus speeds was self-inflicted. In the whole of Britain, of course, with largely double-deck fleets, which are slower anyway, we did the madness of converting to one person, one man, as it was originally, operation, where the conductor's job was given to the driver with a graduated fare scale,
Yes.
giving change. Completely and utterly bonkers. Most of the rest of Europe, led by the Swiss and the Germans, gave the conductor's job to the passengers. When we did that in London, the one and only time, sadly not to Boris's liking, we had fabulous, nearly 400 of them, articulated buses that saved millions of pounds in operating costs, fewer drivers, larger capacity, better priority on a lot of those routes. And the vision, certainly in my head, possibly also Peter Hendy's, I'm not so sure about Leon, was that we would ultimately see those sorts of really busy routes with Arctics upgraded to tramways. Then we would start to compare ourselves, not with Brighton and Hove, with relatively low UK-style numbers of trips per head of population, but look at Zurich, look at Vienna, look at Amsterdam, look at Berlin, where the tram is really giving the speeds that make people give up their cars. I can't see how we're going to do that, even in London.
Well, several things there. I mean, the first thing is, I'm not sure I totally agree about the new works programme. At the time that those loans were given, they were loans, and therefore they were investment. And in the post-Gordon Brown period, there's been a tendency to confuse giving away money or spending money with investment. So they were investment. They were cheap loans that the government gave that were intended to be repaid. Now, the problem they had was they already had loads of debt, because you can imagine how expensive, we know how expensive the Elizabeth line was a few years ago. In 1900s money, you know, the Piccadilly line and the Northern line was a similar problem. So what the government was doing in the 30s was helping them, but they weren't just gifting them money. The intention was it would be repaid. On the point about boarding speeds, of course, they did try in the 60s the arrangements with kind of zonal fares and so on, you know, wood green and all this kind of thing. And the problem there was, of course, the technology wasn't up to the aspiration. The mechanical ticket machines didn't work, and they backed off it very quickly. But, you know, and you can see some of what Peter Hendy did, I think, you know, 20, 30 years later, was a kind of revival of that, having ticket machines at the stop so they didn't last very long instead of on the buses. But there's some feedback there. On the question of trams, I would half agree with you. I think if you're going to use trams with very large amounts of tram priority as an alternative to very expensive underground investments, they can work. But if you look at UK tram construction costs, they are orders of magnitude higher than continental ones. And there are various reasons for that. Planning, the unwillingness to use standard equipment, too many judicial reviews and so on. So I can totally buy into the idea of, you could even replace probably parts of the urban rail network, the heavy rail network, with trams that go off into the street a la Karlsruhe. So I can imagine all that working out. But you won't be able to do that unless you bring the per mile cost down dramatically. On the question of why hasn't there been more investment, I'm going to disagree with you again, Andrew. Public spending is at an 80-year high. And the reason it's an 80-year high is essentially for three reasons, which are not directly connected with transport. Number one was the bank bailout in 2008. Number two was the planned increase in public spending by the Blair-Brown government. And number three was the cost of COVID. And so UK debt, I had that picture of the lovely Rachel who looked at one of those forecasts. UK debt is 100%. Now, I'll try and bring this back to transport. In 2025, in some months, the government has borrowed a sum of money equivalent to the entire cost of the Elizabeth line in 1 month. In 1 or 2 months, they've borrowed two Elizabeth lines in 1 month just to pay interest on the existing debt. So I think that is the constraint on public spending, and this has been brewing along now for really about 10 years, more than 10 years. So the government, or TfL, they'll have to find a way of funding some of these things with private financing, because it's quite likely that there will be a funding crisis. I mean, the government can't keep borrowing money. And so, conversely, there are people who would like to invest in transport assets who might invest in such things on appropriate terms. So I think that's why they've been constrained. And it's been particularly bad since COVID. I mean, COVID was, immensely costly to tell everyone to sort of stay at home for 18 months. And that's the problem at the moment.
Dark days ahead, maybe.
I don't think dark days ahead, but we should be aware, we shouldn't forget what happened in COVID. There's a danger that we think, well, that was all 5 years ago and we've forgotten about it.
Thank you. Right.
Like Andrew, thank you very much indeed. It's absolutely fascinating. More observations than questions. I come from a background of working in the airlines, London Transport Buses, London Underground, Mainline Railway, and I helped my father do the knowledge to become a cab driver. So I feel I've got a reasonably broad knowledge, if not necessarily in depth. I feel that a lot of it really is politics. I don't think anyone really understands or applies cost-benefit analysis properly. And consequently, the way London Transport is funded, not just now, but for the future as well, is suffering from that. I don't see that there's any investment really, for future passengers. At the moment, the investment seems to be around improving for current passengers. And I'm really concerned about things like Superloop, because every time a new high-speed route comes in, the local routes paralleling it are cut. Now, the biggest opportunity for money is the short-distance passenger, because if a bus runs end-to-end and carries 6 passengers in one seat, that's 6 fares. If one passenger travels the length of the journey, it's only 1. And the cutting of frequencies and the cutting of routes, forcing people to change to complete their journeys, with or without a hopper fare, these all add up to psychological disadvantages, and they disappear.
Can I just kind of jump in and agree with you? If you look at these statistics we've been talking about, those early years, they were carrying both lots of very short distance passengers, but also, per your question, lots of long trips. It was quite possible to make a 7 or 8 mile journey on the red buses at reasonable speed. And as you're alluding, that's really no longer possible. If you go more than 3 or 4 miles, you've probably got to get off and get on another bus or die of boredom. There are a few exceptions, but the journey times are just not competitive. And of course, the cost of running overlapping routes is much higher than running an STL at high speed from Hendon to wherever it went to, Trafalgar Square, at 12 mile an hour average speed or whatever it was.
Yeah, thank you. What other thing is the fare structure is also a disincentive to travel. The one thing we lack in London is a single journey intermodal ticket. So that way, people are discouraged from travelling. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat, so allow for me. We're not really looking at how do we make it attractive for the passenger. We're looking at how do we make the network attractive, which is slightly different from a psychological point of view. So is it really a market? Transport is an instrument of derived demand. You don't get on a bus unless there's a reason to go to the other end of the journey, setting aside the enthusiast movement.
Well, I'm not sure that is true. Let me disagree with you now.
Yeah.
I think a lot of their market in the 30s and what they were trying to do is what my mother would call the nice bus ride. It's a bit like the nice cup of tea that old people are always going to get at National Trust tea rooms. They don't have to go to the National Trust tea room to have the cake, and they don't have to go for the bus ride. But at the moment, you wouldn't make a nice bus ride on the 15. I mean, it's a horrible experience in various ways. And so I disagree somewhat. I mean, trying to generate off-peak demand and optional demand is part of the story of growing the market. And you see this in other parts of the country. And again, Brighton would be a very good example of this. So I think there is a large optional market that is not being exploited to the maximum at the moment.
It still remains that you've got to give people the incentive to travel.
Oh, yes.
And the destination is the key to that.
Yes.
So a growth in the economy will develop a growth in passengers. But the key thing really is frequency. Time after time, survey after survey, frequency is the most important factor. And every time a route headway is reduced, it's another disincentive to travel. The other thing also goes along with that, and I know you could argue this, fuel duty has been frozen for a very long time. Consequently, it's making the costs of public transport go up, particularly on the railways, because the railways have got to pay for themselves. But it's a generalised thing. It is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to operate a car as opposed to using public transport. If you get in a car, it's one expense. If you use passengers, family go, it's 4 fares. We need group fares of some description. But, you know, I really do appreciate everything you've said and done, and there is a lot to learn, and there's a lot more to carry on. So thank you again very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Hand up there.
Thanks very much for an interesting talk. I think the key issue is journey times. And you go to the continent and jump on trams, and quite often, but not always, they have priority at traffic lights. Occasionally they cross major intersections and have to wait, but more often than not, they have priority at traffic lights and with minor junctions. We don't have that in the UK, either for trams, let alone for buses. And it's a relatively easy thing to do for councils or for TfL to do and for councils in other parts of the country to do. Is that likely to be possible or feasible?
Yes, we do.
It's certainly possible and feasible, and it's really per Andrew's question. I mean, they've had this kind of technology in places like the Netherlands for a long time. Leon can give us the detail, but there is a traffic signal linkages to the buses do occur in London. I think the issue is that the degree of political will that's needed to have, a Paris-type busway in central London. And that is what is missing. I mean, the journey times, it's not a technological problem. I think the problem is the politics of creating some of the busways that you see in Paris. Now, Paris is interesting because they are also removing bus lanes for very similar reasons to London. And bus journey times in Paris, on my regular trips there, are decaying also for very similar reasons to some of the problems in London. But it is certainly technically doable and has been since at least the 1970s. But the argument for creating TfL was they would have a bigger role in the highway than its predecessor organisations did. And I think on that there has been some backward progress, because essentially for the last 10 plus years the politics has been to favour cycling and pedestrians over virtually everything else. And I think that is at the core of the problem. I don't know whether Leon, who was in the hot seat, wants to disagree or agree with that. He's, for those who can't see him, he's giving you his non-committal face.
Couple more, if we can.
Thank you. An observation and a question. The observation is you correctly looked at the London Transport Annual Reports going back from 1934. I've been looking at the TfL annual reports from sort of 2000 onwards, and under Mayor Ken Livingstone there were lots of important, impressive things done on the bus network, less impressive things done under Boris perhaps, and almost nothing under Khan. But interestingly, the number of pages about buses was probably about 20 in the Ken years, probably 10 under Boris, and it's now down to about 1. In fact, if you read the last Commissioner's report to the board, it only had 2 paragraphs on buses, and that's a 170-page document. Doesn't that sum it up? My question is something you just touched on, and that's the costs of the operation, and particularly tendering. Now, we've had 40 years of tendering, and it's worth looking back to see how far we've got and what the future is. I understand that when tendering first started about 40 years ago, there were about 30 plus bus operators that were bidding for contracts, and now it's down to about 6. I've been looking at tender awards recently, and in many instances they were awarded to, there was only 1 bidder. So what do you do? And that bidder put up its costs by 40%. compared to the last round on the same group of routes. So is that sustainable? Is the current tendering model in London sustainable? Should they look at a different type of model, or should there be a comprehensive review of the whole network?
So on the point about the annual reports, I wasn't going to be rude about the TfL annual reports, but you've invited me to be so I will take that opportunity. If you read the 1934 reports that were produced by people at 55 Broadway wearing horn-rimmed spectacles and looking at huge pieces of paper, the data is very logically laid out, and you can understand what's going on and how much money was spent on feeding the horses at Amersham Station and oiling the Green Line gearboxes. The TfL annual report, like many annual reports, is a kind of extraordinary document full of glossy pictures and things, and it's actually very hard to see core information. I think there isn't a number in there for the bus losses. Nowhere to be found. We believe that the bus deficit is in the order of £1 billion a year by analysis. You would have thought that the TfL board would wish to understand that. I'm not particularly critical of TfL. I think this is a general trend in annual reports that they've lost their way, and they should be in black and white and only contain numbers and no pictures of any of the directors patting any staff or children on the head. So I agree with you. Your second question was about bus operating costs. So the question we should ask is, why do we outsource the operation of the buses? And there are several reasons why you might want to do that. The first one is that the private sector should be better at managing costs. And you could see from some of this story that London Transport struggle to control costs. The second reason is, per my point about the miserable problems facing the Chancellor, is that you've got a shortage of capital, and you can think about the outsourcing being a kind of PFI. Essentially, TfL is renting capital from the bus operators. Now, the quid pro quo of all that is that sometimes the operators will suffer cost mistakes. And if you look at the profitability of the bus operators in London, they've been through a period when they've made quite substantial losses on average. In fact, if you add up all the profits and losses, I haven't done it for a while, they were all losing money. So there will be corrective periods when prices will go up. But you have to ask the question, if TfL were running the buses themselves, could they do it more efficiently than Stagecoach or Go Ahead? I would say probably not. And has the government, or has TfL, which, let's be honest, it is the government, has it got a spare, X 100 million or billion to buy a load of electric buses? I think the answer is no. So those are reasons number 1 and 2. Reason number 3 that you might involve the private sector is to collect good ideas. And in the early stage of tendering, it wasn't just about lowest cost, it was also an element of, have you got any good ideas? And I think what's happened since 2000 is the whole thing has become very homogenous. So you could imagine a different kind of tendering where which is really what they did in the early stages of tendering, say this is the minimum level of service, but what can you bring to it? Now the problem with that is bureaucrats would have a problem with evaluating good ideas. It's very difficult to evaluate good ideas in a very systematic way, and so I think the conclusion is we'll ask everyone to bid on exactly the same basis, and whoever offers the lowest price is obviously the winner, and I understand that. But I still think there's something in that, and the early days of tendering, that they weren't just brilliant ideas of the London Transport mandarins at the time. Some of those brilliant ideas were other people's ideas that they offered up to them, and I think that has been lost. But I personally would be very surprised if they decided to do anything dramatically different. The one thing they might consider, and I alluded to it, is it might be more effective to convert depots to electric vehicles than routes, or at least do groups of routes rather than treating every route as a little project. And I don't think they would have done the trolleybus conversion in 4 years had they done it the way we're doing it at the moment.
Good point, actually. I think we could probably continue this discussion. We're on to a run here, and thank you so much for raising matters we don't often touch on, but is it the bedrock and the foundation of the business that we love, you have described and shown. Thank you very much for that. I think I did go back. I think one point I think I speak to Andrew in previous times was on the continent there seems to be around a number of countries the thinking of we're going to make our journeys. Some we can make by car, some we can make by tram, some we can walk. A bit of pre-planning might be a bit of education we could give people. You don't have to use the car for every journey. You can do other things, and there are the buses and so on, but to be debated another day. Now, before I conclude, is there anything urgent here? All right. Before I forget, otherwise I should be told off, details of the next meetings before we come to a conclusion. They're obviously all in the website. We have on the 1st of October, Chris Green of Network South East fame giving a talk at the Abbey Community Centre. It's already, I think, pretty well up to 100% filled capacity, but I think there might be the odd space if somebody wants that. We then have on the 13th of October here a movie night with Barry Coward showing some of the stuff that the British Transport Films produced way back. So I think that might be one night at the movies, 13th of October. And then over in Acton, we have on the 25th of September, Paul London explaining some of the stories emerging from analysing the London General Omnibus Company minutes, and minutes, I think, of some of the other organisations around in the past. But they've been transcribed into readable manner. An awful lot of interesting information is coming about the decision-making in the bit before you kindly explore tonight. And then on the 23rd of October, we mark or commemorate or remember the 95th anniversary of the loss of the airship R101 and the ending of that form of transport, really. It carried on a bit longer with the Americas, but broadly speaking, what was thought to be a magnificent way to go long-distance travel in an airship disappeared during the mid-30s. And Paul Ross will explain something of what was going on and mark the 95th anniversary of Britain's flagship airship. The rest is on the website, guys, and thank you again for coming. Thank you, sir, for a detailed explanation. I think we need to explore further some of this and have further debates on it. And please, a safe journey home, hopefully a journey home without too much hassle. And again, well done for getting here tonight. And may things get easier on the underground, not worse. But anyway, another story. But thank you once more.